Welcome to Grounded, Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won, real-world experiences. Experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's guest is Renae Marshall. Renae Marshall is a Ph.D. candidate at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She studies environmental politics with a focus on understanding bipartisanship. As part of her research, she has read every state-level climate change bill from the past decade, and we discuss what she's learned about what works and doesn't work for bridging partisan divides. We also talk about caucuses in Congress and the important role they play in helping members find common ground and get things done. Renae Marshall, welcome to Grounded, Not Divided.
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. Now, our listeners don't know you as well as I do, so why don't you start by telling us about yourself? Where did you grow up? How did you get interested in politics? And how have you gotten to be at Santa Barbara studying political science?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I grew up in Parker, Colorado, and that really honestly shaped a lot about how I think about politics. So I came from a more liberal leaning family, but the community around me was actually pretty conservative. So just to give the context, the district I grew up in is now represented by Lauren Boebert, which kind of gives you a sense of the political environment. So, long story short is when I was younger, these differences didn't really matter. We were just kids going to school, growing up together. But as polarization kind of started to intensify and I got older and went to high school, I began to notice those divisions more clearly. But at the same time, I kind of still knew these people as friends, as teammates, as neighbors. I really saw their humanity. So seeing both the differences and the shared humanity really helped, stuck with me, and is a big reason why I care so much about understanding different political perspectives. So yeah, I became really interested in environmental science through my AP in environmental science class. I decided to go to Loyola Chicago for environmental sustainability and policy. And I was also a competitive Irish dancer there and, toured across the US and internationally as far as Japan.
Wow.
So yeah, being exposed to different cultures and ways of thinking at a pretty young age, and then being able to be a professional dancer and a college student at the same time, and traveling to different places in the US and across the world really made me just see the world and be curious about how people see the world.
Do you think that seeing different parts of the world makes you appreciate how tribalism is, different and culturally contextual, but also kind of the same everywhere? I always was struck by that coming from Quebec, where I grew up, where French English is the big line of polarization. And then you go, to the US where, sometimes it's Democrat, Republican, sometimes it's race, sometimes it's urban, rural, but it still is kind of the same human nature. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely see that, for sure. But I really enjoyed just the idea of, it's kind of silly, but just dance being this universal language that we all kind of enjoyed together and experienced regardless of political background. So Japan was the only really international place that we spent time touring. So the rest of the time I'd be in kind of like a small town in Texas one weekend. One weekend we went to New York. One weekend we went to a different place in California. So just really seeing a variety of US towns and cities and kind of using this, I don't know, performing arts and dance as a way to bridge divides, which was really cool.
Yeah. So you talked about growing up in Parker,
Yeah.
which is, red leaning, but you were in a blue leaning family. Then you go from Loyola to CU Boulder, which I imagine is a little bit different. And you were there, I think you graduated in 2021, right? So you were there during the summer of 2020. So tell me how polarization looks in your undergrad years at Boulder?
Yeah, I think just going back to like when I grew up, and just kind of seeing the humanity of people across the aisle, like I became kind of distant with my childhood best friend in my undergrad years. Partially because we moved away from each other, but there was definitely some things she was posting online that I was just kind of like, "Ooh, I don't know if I totally agree with that," during kind of when we were in our college years. And I think, yeah, it made me, we're a lot closer now. But when I started kind of like being on campus and seeing different, just like a lot of charged political perspectives, and also kind of seeing the opposite of, on the opposite end of the political spectrum with my friend who was more conservative leaning, I really just became super curious about kind of both ends of the spectrum, of realizing there's so much charged energy, but kind of seeing through that and kind of talking to the person, seeing through kind of the big emotions and the big energy, and yeah, just asking
Yeah.
more questions. So yeah, I definitely like that's an answer more that ties to the way I grew up, but it rings true just kind of with friends that don't see things the same way as you, and you grow and you change and you're in different environments. But yeah, like I think it's important to have differences between you and your friends, and that makes you you. But we need to move past kind of the charged energy and more towards curiosity, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a super important point. Curiosity and shared humanity are two things that come up again and again in the science and practice of reducing polarization, right? So, why did your friend say that, right? And kind of what's behind that? And then your dance example, right? We may disagree about abortion or environmental policy or tax policy, but we can all appreciate dance, right? And music and culture and things like that. So on
Absolutely.
that topic, in the summer of 2020, you and I wrote an op-ed whose original title was the Two-Thirds Majority Platform. I think Arc Digital, where we published it, changed the title in the version that went out. But basically, we were looking at what are policies that most Americans, two-thirds or more, can agree on. And I think you've kept up with some of the more recent polls in that area. So can you give us some examples? What are some policy positions that two-thirds or more of Americans agree on?
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, our work at CU Boulder, where I transferred after Loyola, was really, really shaped the way that I think about my doctoral work, which we'll talk a little bit about later, I'm sure, at Santa Barbara.
Yep.
But first, yeah, with the two-thirds majority platform, it's just this idea that even within really polarized issues, there are actually like more specific policies that have surprisingly broad support, and sometimes not surprisingly. So I guess I'll start with, climate's probably one of the clearest examples. Kind of in our piece, we talk about how people disagree politically on this issue, but there's consensus around large scale tree planting, investments in carbon capture and clean energy innovation, tougher emissions standards on power plants, even things like taxing corporate carbon emissions. And that actually got into the 70% range of support. So, again, support for renewables, wind and solar, it's always consistently high across the board. Um, Healthcare shows a really similar pattern. There's people divided on kind of the bigger systems like the Affordable Care Act or Medicare for All, but there's broader agreement on core problems and specific kind of fixes. So 70% of Americans, for example, say that healthcare, the system is in a crisis. So a lot of people agree about that. And over 70% say the federal government should play a role, some role, in ensuring access to care. So you also see really strong bipartisan support for allowing the government to negotiate drug prices, improve care for veterans, and yeah, that those policies kind of pull above 90%. The veterans one. Um, Infrastructure is a huge area where consensus shows up. roughly three-quarters of Americans support increased federal investment in infrastructure. That could be anything from roads, bridges, water systems, the grid. But even though there's disagreement about how to pay for it, there's kind of this idea of these things are important. They should
Right.
exist in a society that is sustainable for itself.
Yeah, and it strikes me that on even on the issues that seem really polarizing,
Oh
often
yeah,
there's a two-thirds or more position that kind of cuts through the nuance. So, climate and environment, people like clean energy, they like less pollution. They also want their energy to be affordable, right? They don't want to ban fossil fuels, certainly anytime soon. I'm thinking of a recent, not in our poll, but a recent study by Ray Teixeira and Roger Pilkey Jr.
mm,
Some other examples I really like of this that are seemingly super polarizing issues. I think we found in ours that most Americans support border security and more merit based immigration, but they also support a path to citizenship for the DACA recipients, the so called dreamers. Abortion, we didn't talk about this one, I don't think, but I think I've seen polls that find that two-thirds or more or close to that support pretty broad access to abortions in the first trimester and pretty tight restrictions on abortions in the third trimester. So again, it's even in areas where there's really, really deep disagreements on trade-offs and values and things like that, there still often is a big tent middle ground. Values is
absolutely.
another area where it seems like you see the same thing. So I think it was Ipsos just did a study for America's 250th where they were looking at what are values that most Americans share. And I think they found 70% or more support for family. We think family is important. We should treat people of all backgrounds equally. We believe in freedom, justice, and equality. And we believe that our government should do more to bring us together. Are there others that you would add to that list based on your research and polls that you've read?
Yeah, I think kind of tying to that last one that you mentioned, and really interesting report from Ipsos. I'd really add that frustration with gridlock and a desire for government to actually do something. Is a pretty core finding that I've seen. Just I'm a trained political scientist at UCSB, and there's a pretty consistent finding in American public opinion research that a large majority of Americans across parties feel like the political system is way too polarized, not delivering results, and that's just really frustrating. So it's people may disagree on policies, but they also agree that like constant stalemate, like lines at the airports because of shutdowns, partisan fighting, it's just not productive. So I think there's a broad preference for compromise, even though sometimes maybe compromise can be framed as a weakness or um, kind of giving in or maybe not sticking to the party line. I think I think most Americans would actually see it as a strength in some ways. Like they want elected officials to work together to get things done, especially on things that like really affect their daily life. But again,
Yeah,
there's people that prefer more partisan, really stick to their specific policies, but when everyone's waiting in the same line at TSA like and the government's shut down, you can probably imagine that most Americans would not want that and want the government to work together.
totally.
That's a really like extreme example, but
No, but you're totally right. And one of the things that I've also noticed, having met a few sitting and former politicians before, is that even most politicians, in fact, even some of the ones you think are most invested in political theater, are pretty normal behind closed doors, and
sure.
and a lot of the ones, particularly the ones who are not invested as part of their brand in political theater, really do want to get things done. There's this. You probably know more about this than I do, and stop me if we're going to talk about this later when we talk about your research. But I feel like I've read recently about this thing called secret Congress. That's like where I might have the phrase slightly wrong. I think it's secret Congress. But basically, the idea is, there are these high profile issues and battles that we're having out in public, and then there are, maybe more boring from the perspective of news media and social media, but very consequential issues that Congress often on a bipartisan basis, is kind of just humming along and working on behind the scenes. Uh, is that something that you've seen or read about?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about that terminology. I'd have to look more into that. But I think what you really do hit it on the head. So we see in political science research that there are these DW nominate scores, and basically what that means is there are these scores that it's an algorithm that they're put into to see how far away legislators and Congress are from each other. So
Right.
if they're more on the left, they're more liberal leaning, and it like spatially diagrams this. So like if you're more on the left, you've voted in a certain way more often than on the right. So we've seen through this research in political science that there used to be a bunch of dots in the middle, like blue and red dots, blue Democrats and red Republicans in the middle. And over the last, couple of decades, we've seen these like two blurbs of blobs of dots really spreading out with blue on the left and red on the right. And that's just based on the vote
Right.
share or
Roll
like
call. Yeah.
votes, roll call votes. Yes. Excuse me. Yeah. So that's just based on these roll call votes. And there's actually so much more that happens in Congress. There's these voice votes that happen just on regular procedural issues that have to, just happen on a daily basis in Congress to keep the lights on. There's also kind of this other measurement that's really important that's political science research talks about is co-sponsorship coalitions, which we'll talk more about for sure, is if there's legislation that a legislator wants to put their name on and co-sponsor with another congressperson, or they could just do it alone. But these ideas of these coalitions coming together, that's a different measure where you might see some more cross-party or bipartisan, as we might say, cooperation. So, yes, the voting and the vote share and those types of roll call votes, that's a measure that's very polarized and we see that. But as you say, there's lots of different things that happen behind, kind of, not that we don't see on the media that keeps things going, and there's tons of broad support in Congress for.
So let's zero in on climate change again, because you've done some
Sure.
really interesting work on that.
Yeah.
So we talked about a couple minutes ago how Americans broadly like renewables. They like tech, they like R&D, they like infrastructure. They also really care about cheap energy. Uh, they don't like pollution. So with that framing in mind, maybe it might be easier than we think to find common ground. And you read initially every state level climate change bill, meaning decarbonization, so not including bills that say we want to roll back climate policies, for example. You read every state level bill from 2015 to 2020. You're currently updating that study up to 2024, I believe.
Yeah.
So, just to give us a sense first, how many bills are we talking about here? Like, how many state level climate bills have there been, and how many of them passed, roughly?
Great question. So, I have spent the last 6 years, we started our work together on this project, and I think 2019, and then or 2020. And
It's 2020, yeah.
I think in 2020 we started. And so that original data set included 2015 to 2020 bills. That is also kind of, the end of the last Obama administration and into the Trump Pence administration. And I recorded about 860, 870 bills. Over 400 of those passed, and about 200 were bipartisan. So
And
we're looking at like
bipartisan,
bipartisan co-sponsorship, as I was just talking
right.
about, the kind of the ways that we can measure cross-party or bipartisan cooperation is through legislators signing on or co-sponsoring legislation.
Now
So
you might
yeah.
think that bipartisan, if you're, if you don't know anything about your study and all you think is what you hear in the news that Democrats passed climate policy and Republicans don't, right? You might think that bipartisan means, well, it was passed in a blue state with a blue legislature and there was one Republican who signed on or something. But that's not really what you found, right? Like, tell me about, which states are passing these? Are they blue states? Are they red states? Are they purple states? Are they all of them? What did you find?
Yeah, I mean, all of them are. I think I went into the project thinking, when we were going into it, maybe I wouldn't really find many in red or Republican controlled state legislatures, but I actually found that about a third of all the bills that passed, so out of the kind of the half that passed of that 870 about, were passed in Republican controlled state legislatures. I will say that the um, divided governments, or we would say purple governments, just where the state control is kind of divided between Democrats and Republicans, though those types of governments were most associated with bipartisan bills passing. So yeah, that's a key result. But again, Democrat controlled state legislatures pass the most decarbonization bills, and that's just kind of a trend we've seen.
Sure.
Makes sense. But it was surprising to see about a third were passed in red states.
Okay, so let's talk about these bills that were passed either with bipartisan co-sponsors in red states or both.
Hmm.
What did they look like broadly? You did some really interesting analyses of what their general characteristics tended to be. And then can you give a couple of specific examples that illustrate that?
Sure, absolutely. So, yeah, the more bipartisan laws, we can really see that they're focused on expanding consumer or business choices. They have financial incentives. They don't restrict consumer or business choice. And by expanding and restricting, I mean restricting is like standards and requirements, and expanding is like, you can have multiple kinds of energy when you're, buying a house or like building something new. You can,
Creating a new option that didn't
yeah,
exist
a new
before.
option that
Yeah.
didn't exist before. Basically, you can do that in the transportation sector, again, the building sector. So yeah, I'll just say, for example, in Georgia, there's a solar financing law that opened up the market by allowing leasing and third party ownership. It was framed around kind of competition and lowering costs, and that really appealed to kind of a free market and a free market ideology, but also had this environmental priority wrapped with it. You can see in similar things in states like Arkansas and South Carolina, where legislation expanded access to solar. Again, this kind of focused on giving consumers and businesses more choice, making it easier to adopt. Again, those are kind of more on the red state side of things, but you also see examples of bipartisan legislation in Connecticut, where, transportation bills include expanding access to affordable transit as a broader effort to reduce emissions from cars and, just vehicles. And that's really about access and infrastructure. But then there's also, in Delaware, there's a policy that helps small businesses improve energy efficiency, that lowers their costs and also reduces their emissions at the same time. So, what I'd want to say about all of these bills that I've just talked about is that the common thread is they expand choice, they lower costs, and they improve access to things. They're delivering these like tangible benefits to people's daily lives, and like the climate stuff and the decarbonization stuff kind of comes with that.
Totally fascinating. Now, at the federal level, probably most people are familiar with the seesaw of federal vibes, right?
Sure,
In the
absolutely.
federal government, and to some extent also a seesaw with federal policy.
Yeah.
And yet, there's also been some bipartisanship at the federal level over the last 5 to 10 years. Can you give some examples of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you see it in laws like the Energy Act of 2020. It focused on clean energy innovation, like things like carbon capture, energy storage, grid modernization. Um, and then, you can also see the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Again, that's kind of more grid resilience, electric vehicle infrastructure, lots of infrastructure things. And there's lots of support from both parties. The American Innovation and Manufacturing Act is another good example, really phased down potent greenhouse gases, passed with bipartisan backing, specifically related to the hydrofluorocarbons. Again, that one was pretty recent. And then also the Chips and Science Act. It's about semiconductors and competitiveness. So it's maybe not like super related to climate, but invests a lot in the, I want to say, like innovation ecosystem that kind of, I would say, like underpins clean energy and decarbonization. So
And
it's not labeled as a climate policy, but it's very much a part of that same story.
And science is another interesting thing, right? Where the both Trump administrations, the White House budget requests have included pretty large cuts to climate science in particular, and the more recent one, science generally. And yet the congressional cuts have been much smaller. And in fact, I think in the first Trump administration, they were small increases year over year in the congressional appropriations for science. Is that is that related to the fact that there's this, at least at the congressional level, more bipartisan energy around R&D and science and things like that?
Yeah, I'd say so. It's definitely I kind of want to answer that question by tying it to my new research. I actually recorded whether there's a technological innovation component to the new bills that I looked at from 21 to
So this is
24.
the update
The
of your
update
previous
of the
study. Yeah.
bills. So not talking about federally, but just from my experience looking at the tech innovation side of things. Um, that component is associated both with more, a higher likelihood of passage, and those bills are disproportionately enacted and bipartisan. So it's kind of this, I think, from what I'm still kind of going through the results, so I'm not quite sure, but I think that there's this kind of spin of like just science and innovation and learning new things, that is really appealing, and that, as I said, really underpins the idea of expanding clean energy and making it more accessible, making it, better connected to the grid, things like this. So, yeah, I think there's something there with that framing and that approach to decarbonization that is appealing.
So besides that, I think the other thing that you mentioned you found in your new study is there's just a lot more bills, right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
tell me about that. What else are you
Yeah.
seeing that's new?
Absolutely. So I added about, this is really fascinating. I added about 1,600 bills that passed between 21 and 24. So in the Biden Harris administration.
It's about four
And
times more as
four
the
times more,
yeah,
I
wow.
know. And so like here's a fun fact too is I've read over 8,000, I think 8,800 bills in total to kind of, get the full range of this. So again, I didn't include bills that were kind of anti-decarbonization or just were like minor changes or, like even, yeah, like, so that's what kind of the 8,000 were. And then I found these, my final data set from 2015 to 24 is of just over 2,500 bills. So added
Wow.
about 1,600. And then in the second time frame, like 921 of those passed of the new 1,600 bills, and about 350 were bipartisan. So um,
So about
a,
twice as much as the
about
first
twice
period.
as much.
I miscalculated thinking they had all passed.
Yeah. Oh, no, no, no. I wish. But yeah, so a lot, like a way higher passage rate. And what I found is that it's not just concentrated in Democrat controlled states. There's there's an increase across all state partisan contexts. So in divided governments and in Republican controlled governments. So I'm seeing that, you know, in the 2015 to 2020 period, they states really took the lead. I would say there was a lot of, while we just talked about some more bipartisan, things that have happened in the past couple of years, especially, under the Trump Pence administration, it was largely a period of retrenchment. And by retrenchment, I mean kind of attacks on, decarbonization and, pulling out of the Paris Accord, rolling back the Clean Power Plan. So what we see in 2015 to 2020 is states kind of taking the lead in a way. Um, but then in 21 to 2024, we see just like they all kind of went crazy and passed even more bills. So I thought that was really fascinating.
Let me just ask one quick follow on, and then purely asking you to speculate here because this isn't
Sure,
in your.
absolutely.
So one of the things that I've seen in other contexts, mentions of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, on earnings calls goes way up, kind of around, and peaks around the early 2020s, and then has come pretty far down. Similar story for DEI. The similar story, maybe we think is currently something we're working on in our group for carbon credits, carbon credit issuances. Um, and then there's been, I haven't seen some rigorous research on this yet, but we did a study looking at the effect of climate change in 2016 and 2020 in the federal election. It seemed like it had a bigger effect in 2020 than 2016, although it's hard to measure exactly how big it is. The polls that I saw suggested that in 2024, it still was a net positive for the Democrats. This is what we found in our study for 2016 and 2020. But it certainly wasn't as big of an issue on the campaign trail that people were talking about. So my question is, do you think that we're going to see the same kinds of things at the state level, in the sense that, or do you think that we're going to see over the next 3 to 4 years a smaller number of bills than we saw in the last 5 years, maybe even the last 10 years? Or do you think that what you're seeing in the state level data is really a kind of momentum that's just going to keep humming along underneath the surface? Again, I'm totally asking you to
Ooh,
speculate.
yeah.
Just love to hear your take.
Oh, that's a great question. That is, yeah. So I guess just speculating. Um, so the reason why, like one of the mechanisms of, one of the reasons why we might be seeing more decarbonization bills passing during periods of what I call federal prioritization. So prioritizing decarbonization in executive orders, and we had, the Inflation Reduction Act passed that invested a lot in clean energy and lots of subsidies, things like this. The reason why is because there's potentially just a lot more alignment across state and federal governments. There's a better playbook for states to be like, okay, the federal government has, there's funds for this, there's a playbook, like, okay, we can do this. But without that, it's just creates more friction. It creates more friction for states who want to be active on a certain policy area to do so. So where there's less friction in Democrat-controlled state governments, and again, I'm painting a broad brush. There's lots of, differences within even the Democratic Party on climate and priorities, but in general, we're seeing more passage in Democrat-controlled state governments, less friction versus in Republican and sometimes divided governments. So I would think that just my opinion would be that Democrat controlled states will continue humming along, as you say. I think divided governments will do so as much as they can. And I think it will, yeah, kind of just depend on really like maybe where the Republican state is. Maybe they're really in Florida, really, really, vulnerable to climate risks like, flooding and, like just lots of issues on the coast. Maybe that will play into more adaptation policies, which aren't decarbonization. But I think it will follow more of the 2015 to 2020 pattern over the next couple of years. I don't think decarbonization will ever just not pass in the states, which is, comforting. But I think during periods of federal prioritization, the opportunity to make a lot more progress is there.
That makes sense. So I want to pivot to one other area of bipartisanship that we haven't talked about that you've really focused a lot on in your PhD research, and that's caucuses. So we talked about,
Sure.
you know, public opinion and where there's common ground. You've given some great examples of where Democrats and Republicans can come together to find bills that they can pass together on areas that they agree on, even if they disagree on other areas. So what are caucuses, and how have you come to understand their importance in the context of bipartisanship?
Yeah, great question. I have really kind of spent a lot of my doctoral work on these informal institutions. So, caucuses are basically just groups where legislators, they don't have to be a part of the same party. They can come together informally, talk about policies, talk about just issues related to different policies. They can advance them, kind of coordinate around them, but they don't have to. It's really just an informal way, kind of how you were talking about secret Congress before. Is it's just this informal meeting that you can have, and there's lots of different caucuses. There's between 600 and 700 operating, I believe, in this current Congress, and they're all they're not all, but a majority of them are devoted to specific issues, and a majority of those are also bipartisan. So it's a really interesting informal institution that complements other formal institutions in Congress, like committees, for example. That's where legislation gets proposed and marked up and sent to the floor. And that's more of the formal way. That's kind of like a league game in basketball versus a pickup game in basketball, which is informal and people from different teams can kind of play and navigate different plays and things like this. So it's it's a really interesting place where there's still bipartisan contact, which is why I'm so interested in it. And I've looked at it in two different ways, so representation and public opinion, but I've also kind of looked at, okay, do these groups really do anything from an effectiveness lens? So with climate, I've looked at this for about six American politics issues, but one of them is energy and the environment. And there's a number of bipartisan caucuses around issues like climate change. For example, one of them is the Climate Solutions Caucus, started in 2016 by a Republican and Democrat in Florida. It's actually structured so members have to join in bipartisan pairs. So they have to, if you're a Republican and want to join, you have to join with a Democrat. So yeah, they're like, just to answer your question, they exist. There's these groups that exist for legislators across the aisle to come together and talk about climate, decarbonization issues.
So I want to go back to the two specific things you mentioned about, what do members of Congress think about it? What do the public think about it? But first of all,
Yeah,
just
sure.
as a conceptual idea, do you think that it's just by virtue of creating a meeting space to talk about some issue, creating a meeting space to be in the same room for Democrats and Republicans, that keeps the cooperation and the issue on the radar in a way that it wouldn't otherwise be? Is that kind of the main conceptual function of it?
100%. Yeah, I've done a couple of interviews with, kind of former Congress members and interest group leaders who have either kind of helped start a caucus or have participated in caucuses, specifically climate ones. And yeah, it's really hard. It's kind of like just this invisible, stuff that keeps Congress together, kind of. You have contact outside of your formal committee work or your party, your party caucus, which is different. That's a different caucus than what I'm talking about, issue specific caucuses. And you get to just kind of see them informally. And sometimes you meet up and you're going on a hike or you're going on some sort of, yeah, just like outing where you're talking about these specific issues and you happen to find common ground on them. Or I'm just kind of speaking from some of my my interviewees experiences of how just being in this informal setting kind of creates what I'm going back to when I was a kid, just humanizing, oh wow, this is a colleague or even a friend of mine, and they might see things different on a lot of things, a lot of policy issues that I care about, but wow, they actually really care about the environment, or they have really specific interests in, clean water, clean air. Maybe they're from an ag state and there's lots of, sustainable ag types of things. So yeah, I absolutely think you're correct on that.
So it sounds like the people in Congress who were in these caucuses really like them. What does the public think about them?
Yeah, so I ran two national survey experiments in 2024 where people evaluated hypothetical legislators in the House working on issues like border security and climate change. So these two issues, and I had different treatments in this survey using actual real caucuses that exist. So there's a bipartisan border security caucus. There's a partisan one on the Republican side and a partisan one on the Democratic side, and the same exists for climate change. Um, and so I kind of varied whether those legislators joined the bipartisan version of the, border security or climate change caucus or the partisan one, and yeah, whether they were co-partisans or out-partisans. So a co-partisan would be like a Democrat respondent in the survey sees a Democratic legislator and Republican sees a Republican, and an out-partisan would be like a Democrat respondent sees a Republican legislator or vice versa. So I really found that across the board, bipartisan caucus membership improves how these legislators are viewed by people in the other party without much backlash from their own side. So out partisans are, like it improves their ratings of this legislator, and co-partisans aren't that mad about it. So it's generally a low cost signal, I would say, from this study. Of course, there's, it's social science. There's lots of, issues with survey
Sure.
experiments
Yeah.
and all of that. But I would say that they're low cost signals for legislators to signal that they care about something, even if maybe they can't or, aren't voting in line with that, potentially because of, lots of reasons, party loyalty, things like this. But on the effectiveness side, though, I would say that it's interesting. I've found that caucuses on their own aren't really linked to higher effectiveness in specific issues, but when they're overlapped with committee roles, so what I was saying before, committees on natural resources or specific committees where legislation actually moves, you actually see a pretty positive relationship. It's a synergistic relationship between being on a caucus that's related to the environment and also having a committee role that's related to the environment, which is really fascinating.
Do people tend to be like, if you're on a bipartisan caucus about climate, are you also in the conservative climate caucus or the Democrat climate caucus? Or is it really tend to be kind of you're in one or the other?
Really great question. Really great question. So I found that there's definitely kind of an asymmetry in membership. So most committee members of, a specific issue committee are caucus members, but there's lots of caucus members who are not on that committee. So for a large like a large amount, I don't want to say majority maybe, of caucus members, it's mostly just the caucus and not being on a committee
But what
because
about
yeah.
caucus like partisan versus bipartisan? So, for example,
Oh,
climate,
yeah.
there's bipartisan climate caucuses, there's a
Sure.
conservative climate caucus. I'm sure the Democrats have a climate caucus. Are
Yeah.
you seeing a lot of, like, if you're in the bipartisan caucus, are you the people who really care and you're also in your partisan caucus, or is it kind of three
Oh,
different
that's
groups?
that's really interesting. I'm actually not sure, but that this is yeah, super preliminary observational evidence that I've kind of started finding. That would be really interesting. I've looked at just on the whole, partly because there's a lot fewer partisan caucuses. There's way more bipartisan caucuses. So yeah, like I wouldn't be able to tell you that specifically, but I just do know that the bipartisan ones are the most common, and we're seeing. I did, an analysis of just the bipartisan ones and took the partisan ones out,
Sure.
and basically the same effects are the same. So I need to kind of look more into the subsets of partisan versus bipartisan, but really just the overall takeaway is that these informal groups have a really synergistic relationship with the formal system of Congress.
Yeah, and there must be. I mean, there must be at least some overlap. I'm thinking of, you and I moderated a panel a few years ago with
Oh, yeah.
Representative Jonah Goose, who's a Democrat, who I believe is on both the bipartisan and the partisan climate caucuses, and
Yeah.
John Curtis, a Republican, who's now in the Senate, who for sure was on both partisan and bipartisan, I believe. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit.
And the bipartisan wildfire caucus, both Joe
That's right.
Neguse and John Curtis, because their states, Colorado and Utah, have a lot of wildfire risks. So that was something that they talked about even on the panel. I remember they were talking about how that that priority is really important to them and their constituencies. So
Well,
they were on that.
that's a great example which illustrates the fact that, even if you disagree on climate, there's a lot of climate adjacent issues people agree on. We talked
Totally.
about infrastructure already, adaptation, wildfires, public lands is another one where there's been a lot of bipartisanship in Congress, including pushing back on some of the federal stuff that was in the one big beautiful bill. I think there was somebody had put in a plan to sell some public lands, and there was huge pushback from
Right.
both parties. Uh, okay, so shifting gears a little bit, but within the idea of bipartisanship, we have a contentious midterm election coming up,
Sure.
and it's a midterm election where potentially control of the Senate and the House may be decided, right?
Yeah.
uh, so suppose that you're giving advice, and this isn't a partisan podcast, so I don't want you to tell us who to vote for, but suppose that you're just giving advice to candidates in either party that are running in contested districts, meaning districts where both parties have a chance.
Sure.
What would be your advice to them on how to run a big tent campaign with respect to the climate, environment, energy issue?
Great question. Great question. Yeah, I would frame this less as advice, and I think more as what I've seen the evidence suggests from some of my research,
Which
which
is the
is,
best advice you can give,
I
right?
guess, yeah. Yeah, so I'd say like first start with, and it's kind of cheesy, but like start where there's already agreement on things. I think there's a tendency for campaigns to lead with the most polarizing issues because it really can like energize a base. And I think, it's important, like that there are differences in parties. And I'm not trying to say that like paint this really, blindly optimistic bipartisanship story. Like, there's clear differences. And I think that's important between the parties and viewpoints, but there's actually a lot of political space in the middle where a majority of Americans already agree. I would also say to focus on, a lot of my research has, talked about financial incentives and expanding consumer and business choices in the renewable energy transition or just decarbonizing. I would say focus on the tangible outcomes, things that are practical, visible, tied to everyday life, lowering costs, improving infrastructure, improving access to infrastructure. If we're going to subsidize electric vehicles, we need to figure out how they're going to be charged. Or, you know, expanding access to, just expanding access to these opportunities. I think that resonates a lot more than kind of abstract or, you know, really highly ideological messaging. And that kind of ties into an idea of like, I think framing is super important. I would be careful with how issues are framed. And I don't think we talked about it too much, but one thing briefly
Yeah, how
that
how do we
my,
not how should
yeah,
we frame it, and how shouldn't we frame it?
yeah, one thing my research shows, Matt, you and I worked on this paper after I finished, kind of before I went to UCSB, but it's a paper on bundling. So bundling decarbonization policies with different types of policies, ranging from more social justice leaning policies, economic justice. Um, we did an infrastructure bundle, and then a more conservative, which is more broadly appealing, and then a more conservative appealing bundle, which was reducing EPA
And
regulations.
sorry, just to quickly clarify, just for listeners who don't know what a bundle
Oh,
is,
yes.
you're talking
Sorry,
about
yes.
a climate change policy and then in the same bill, some other policy. So we're going to do something about emissions and we're going to build infrastructure, or we're going to do something about emissions and we're going to create union jobs, or we're going to do something about emissions and we're going to create an equity commission to study disparities across race and gender groups. So I'm giving examples that are sort of close to what we had in our study, right? Or we're going to
Sure.
reduce emissions and reduce regulations or pause regulations. So that's what a bundle is. And we're basically asking people what they think about, just the climate policy or the climate policy with the other policy. And what did you find?
Yeah, so I basically find that there that yeah, that if you bundle with more ideologically charged things, so I would say in that study it was more of the social justice leaning language, and then the more reducing regulation bundle, as you said, you can actually lose support without gaining new voters. So there's like a real value, I would say, in keeping your proposals clear, focused, grounded, and widely shared goals. And I'm not saying that social justice or reducing regulation, like, I'm not trying to say anything about how broadly, each of them are supported or by who, but just the way that they're framed, or just the way that your ideas are framed, can resonate very differently with different voters, I would say. And
It's not
then,
just framing, right? It's also like voters like and dislike different things. I
oh,
think what you were
yes.
saying earlier is like the voters, you know, whether or not you as the policymaker agree with what the voters are telling you doesn't mean, it doesn't undermine the fact that the voters like or don't like something, right? And so
Exactly.
the
Exactly.
finding
That's a good
what
way to
they
put
like
it.
and don't like is useful information regardless of what you as the policy wonk think is the, quote unquote right policy. Isn't negativity bias a theme here, right? So the example
Oh,
I always
right.
give
Yeah.
when I talk about our study is, I say, raise your hand if you would support a candidate that supports both open borders and a total ban on abortion. And I've never had anybody raise their hand, right? And
Right.
it's not that there's nobody who supports banning abortion. It's not that there's nobody who supports open borders, but there's nobody who supports both those things. And usually you dislike one of them more than you like the other one, if you like
Right.
either
So
of them, right?
you're
There's lots of
you're
people who dislike both. And so this is a general psychological thing, right? People react stronger to things they dislike than things they like. And so, in your study, you're finding uh, like, right coded policies are maybe losing, reducing regulations are losing moderates and liberals, and more than they're gaining conservatives, and left coded policies like social justice are losing moderates and conservatives more than they're gaining liberals. Is that kind of the pattern?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So you're not gaining any more really support on the side that you would expect to get support on, but you're actually losing on the other side. So, yeah, for sure. And I think that's, I don't want to prescribe specific policy proposals that people, that candidates should adopt, but just kind of thinking about this is useful when you're, thinking about a platform. And then I think, like, lastly on this would be just in the campaigns, just like signal a willingness to actually govern. And I know that there's a lot of evidence that voters across parties are pretty fed up and frustrated with gridlock, and they actually value compromise. So even though that's not how politics is portrayed, um, demonstrating that you can, like, actually work across differences in and of itself could be appealing to a lot of people.
Yeah, that's such an important point, and it comes up in so many
Seems
different.
simple, but I don't know. I just had to say it.
No, it's totally right, and you're totally right about voters perceiving this and being frustrated by this. It reminds me a little bit of academia, where we've been talking a lot in the last couple of years about how shared governance is under fire, and sometimes I'm like, we really like shared governance. We should probably govern ourselves.
Yeah.
Neither here nor there. Okay, the last question that I always ask people, which comes, stealing with attribution from Konstantin Kizin's podcast. He always asks this. I think it's a great question. Is what is something that we're not talking about as a society that we should be?
Right. I think I'm going to try to just tie it back to what I said at the beginning is really we just don't talk enough about the gap between how polarized our politics looks versus how much agreement actually exists underneath it. So I don't want to say like it's important not to be blinded by this like false optimism about bipartisanship. Like we're polarized for real reasons. There's differences in values and, priorities. Not as much on value. Like there's core values, but there's differences in priorities and how people see the role of government and how we should pay for things. And, I think it's important to acknowledge that honestly and rather than just say it's not there. But I think recognizing those differences doesn't mean that we need to be stuck. So like my work suggests that even within that polarization, there are areas where people agree on specific policies, on outcomes of what society should look like, clean air, clean water, um, the idea of just using less to do more, the desire
Affordability, cheap
for government,
energy.
yeah, cheap
Yep.
energy, desire for government to actually function. So I don't think it's the goal shouldn't be to like force consensus where it doesn't exist, but it's to be how do I say it? Like clear-eyed about where we disagree while being intentional about building from areas that we do have common ground. So I would just say that I like the last thing I'll add is I've really branched out. I'm at an environmental science school, but I am also a political scientist, and it really focuses on interdisciplinary work. And I've had a really wonderful opportunity to work with an agroecologist and an economist about a sustainable agricultural practice called intercropping. It's basically where
Hmm.
you grow two types of crops, like mechanized agriculture. So corn and soy, we really depend on those uh, next to each other, and that actually just like reduces their it increases their efficiency. It's just better for the environment and it's also cost effective. But a lot of people in the US, actually hardly any people in the US actually farmers in the US actually adopt it. So that's kind of like there's this sustainable ag practice that should it work, but why is it not? And if there are places where it's working, how are those farmers doing it? That's kind of where we came from. And so what we did is we talked with corn and soy farmers in the Midwest, about 24 of them, I think our sample is, and many who lean more conservative. And going into those conversations, you might expect disagreements about climate or sustainability or, these big things. But that's not how it shows up. A lot of the conversations are about really practical things like how do you adjust your machinery to make harvesting two crops in one field instead of
Right.
one field work? What does it mean for my yields? What is my crop insurance? Like, what are the cost implications? So there's like a lot of openness and even like an entrepreneurial sense to these farmers. They want these new practices and they're framed in terms of efficiency, soil health, long-term productivity. Like it's not an ideological thing. It's like a practical thing that there's some policy barriers even right now that they're struggling with to implement. They want to do the more sustainable thing, but it's hard to because of, certain things like crop insurance, and I won't get too into it. But
Yeah.
that experience really reinforced that like there's just more often common ground than we assume.
Yeah, there's more of a common ground. Working on the common ground often makes the other divisions seem smaller, right? The go back to the
Absolutely.
example of your friend from high school, right? The thing that brings you together isn't the thing you disagree on, it's all the other things that you agree on and share. I think the other point that's really important that you touched on in that last anecdote about the farmers is that researchers talking to people who are doing the thing or working in the industry in the real world, I think there's really a lot of potential for cross pollination. Sometimes I mean, what farmer wouldn't want to do something that's better, right? That's more efficient, that's going to make them more money. And so sometimes by talking to researchers, they learn what that thing is, or maybe they learn what that thing is, and then they go back and forth and figure out what are the barriers that exist. Sometimes the information flows the other way. So, paper I'm working on right now is with my brother, who, for long story short, he's been an investor and a packer in carbon credits,
Right.
and he's come to the conclusion that the voluntary carbon market isn't going to scale to the
Hmm.
gigatons and tens of gigatons that the IPCC says it needs to, right? And so the conclusion there is maybe more in favor of, if carbon capture is part of the solution, then the government needs to play a more active role. But again, there's an example, I think, of where academia got way out ahead of the ball, and then we're really learning something from talking to somebody who's like, no, I'm really trying as an investor to make these things work, and
Yeah.
having here are the challenges that I'm seeing.
Mhm. Yeah, that's exactly it. I heard that from our farmers too, and it wasn't even so I think I misspoke. It wasn't just corn, soy. It was like we were just asking, does anybody do intercropping? There were some like mixed grain farmers in Montana and like different places. So it's a broad study, but it's exactly it. We hear a lot of this sentiment of, we want to do this, but crop insurance doesn't allow me to do this, or the machines I have don't allow me to do this, and I need to figure out how I can either modify them or get new ones and make that, like, once I harvest this crop, how am I going to sort through the grains to sell them on a market?
Right.
Like, it's these really practical things of like, they're already on board. They're already on board with like, this is really helping my soil. The one time I tried it, my soil looks better. There's more microbial activity. Like, it's good. I just need to figure out how to make this work financially for me. I know it can be great, but it's really hard within kind of the constraints I currently have, but I want to. So that's, I think, where researchers, and I think I'm just such a champion for interdisciplinary research. Like, for example, your background in ecology and economics, and then my background in political science, and we've worked with some psychologists in the past, and my partner who's an agronomist. Like, we just don't all have the answers.
Right.
None of us do. And to kind of pretend that we do is actually probably making the problems worse. And we need to listen to each other as researchers, but then also listen to the people on the ground actually like interacting with the systems that are going to change just change the way we interact with our environment, decarbonization through ag or energy. So,
Yeah.
like, change is happening, it's uneven, and it affects people differently depending on where they are, what industry they're in. So, I guess to, just wrap it up, is like the challenge is holding both of these ideas at once. Like, there's these real shared ground, common ground things, but also being honest about how difficult it is to navigate transitions as well.
Yeah. So find common ground,
Find
be
common ground.
curious,
Be
get things
curious.
done, talk to people who do the thing in the real world.
Yeah.
Well, if that's not energized you to be pragmatic, I don't know what will. So, Renae Marshall, thanks so much for coming on Grounded Not Divided, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.